to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you one of my all-time favorite games that I played against the German Grandmaster Ralph Lau. Here is how the game started. d4, d5, c4, e6. Standard Queen's Gambit declined. Knight c3, bishop e7. At one point a few decades ago, there was a belief that this is a more precise move order for black than playing knight f6, although since then that theory has been refuted. It's basically considered equally good for black to play bishop e7 or knight f6. I played knight f3, knight f6, and bishop g5. The other main alternative in this position is to develop my bishop to f4, which I played in many games of mine. Bishop g5 leads to a very different type of game. h6, a very typical move to question the bishop, whether to retreat or trade or what it wants to do. Bishop takes knight in this position has been played many times, even by myself, but the main move is considered bishop h4. Black castles and e3. In this position, black most often continues as my opponent did by playing b6. This is the beginning of the Tartakover variation, named after the great player of about 100 years ago. In this position, white has tried almost any legal move that you can think of. Sounds crazy, but true. Even crazy-looking moves like rook g1 with the idea of an immediate pawn storm on the g-file, or playing a3 on the other side. Not that these would be the most popular or best moves, but just to give an idea the wide range of options that white has here. Some of the main, more popular moves are to trade pawns on d5, or to develop the bishop to e2 or d3, or of course put the rook on c1 because the c-file is so likely to open sooner or later. In this game I chose one of the more aggressive lines in this position, which starts with queen c2. Strategically, the queen does not really belong there because black oftentimes succeeds to open the c-file by playing c7 to c5 a bit later, and then after the exchange of pawns in the center, the c5 will be open and the black rook appears on c8, and then the queen is kind of out of place on c2. However, my intentions were completely different and weren't strategical at all. As you'll see very soon, I had a kingside attack in mind. My opponent chose the most common response in this position to simply develop the bishop to b7. And right now, I chose to exchange my bishop for a knight and then trade on d5. In almost all games in this position, black recaptures with the pawn. This results a strategical achievement for white because now the black bishop is stuck behind that pawn on d5. Although, as I said, in this game my plan wasn't strategical at all, as my next move was to castle to the queen's side with the not too hidden idea of trying to advance my kingside pawns. Here black needs to think very carefully how to continue, and in all reality black needs to play actively because it becomes a race between the two sides on the two opposite sides of the chessboard. As I mentioned, white on one hand wants to play g4 and h4 and g5 and create a very quick pawn storm against black's king. So therefore, black has no time to sit quiet and not to do something similar on the other side of the board. Therefore, moves like knight c6 with the idea of quick knight b4 combined with c5, those are the type of moves black needs to look into in this position. My opponent played, I think, a bit too solid by playing knight d7. Looks like a very natural move, but not ambitious enough. I think it does not cause the most challenge for white in this position. I continued by playing h4. An important moment. So now if black would play g6, my plan was to play h5, trying to open the h file, and black must try to keep it closed, making sure my rook doesn't easily get involved in the game. But now the problem is that the light squares on the b1 h7 diagonal has weakened. And here my next move would be to play queen f5, followed by creating a battery with bishop d3, followed by the checkmate threat of queen h7. Going back to the game situation, after h4, my opponent played c5, understanding the urgency and the need for looking for counterplay on the queen side. And now I simply continued by playing g4. The idea is simple. I'm trying to play g5 and open the g or even preferably h files. My opponent traded pawns on d4, opening the c file, and pawn took back. It's true that the c file has opened, but my knight on c3 for the moment is very well protecting white from any danger. If my opponent would have played g6 here, my plan was to sacrifice a pawn in order to open the files. And here, during the game, my plan was to play h5, which forces the opening of the h file, which is not a bad choice at all. Or, as I learned later, even pawn takes pawn is an interesting alternative, which also sacrifices the pawn in a different way, but gives white an interesting attack. Let's get back to the game, where after ed4, my opponent played queen to c7, which is a tricky move, the black queen immediately trying to come to f4. Typically, for such situations, I made a quiet move, simply getting away from my opponent's threat, king b1. My opponent didn't listen and still played queen f4. Well, he's attacking my knight and pawn at the same time. But I was ready for that and played bishop e2, seemingly only protecting my knight. However, indirectly, my pawn is also protected. Now, after queen takes pawn on g4, I have several good continuations, among them simply playing knight g5, threatening with checkmate on h7, as well as the black king. In this position, my opponent played bishop to e7. A wise move, trying to get away from g5. If in this position instead black would have tried something different, for example, rook c8, I was ready to play g5 and to immediately open the g or h file. Of course, it is suicidal for black to try to win the pawn because queen h7 would checkmate here. Going back to the game, as I mentioned, my opponent played bishop e7 with the idea that when I play g5, which I did, he will play h5. Black's objective was to try to keep the king's side files closed. So then, later on in the meantime, he can advance on the queen side and create an attack there. And now this is a very interesting moment of the game, where in an earlier game in the middle of the 20th century, White played Rook h3, and it was considered a very complicated game after Black played a6, followed by future b5, b4. During the game, I came up with a very original idea, not knowing that this position has reached earlier in a Grandmaster game. It's one of my favorite moves of my chess career because it's so unlikely, it's so unusual, and yet so strong at the same time. I played knight g1 with the idea to chase out the black queen from f4, so then I can advance with my f-pawn to help the attack. The first important moment is that if the black queen would grab my pawn on f2, I would play knight h3, and then if queen takes on h4 as well, I would play bishop takes h5, opening the h-file, as after queen takes bishop, knight f4, the black queen or king would get in trouble. My opponent did not go for the pawn, but simply protected his pawn on h5, which was under attack. And now I was ready to play knight h3, chasing my opponent's queen back. If now the queen captures the pawn on h4, it's certainly not a good-looking move, because if you look carefully, you'll notice that the queen has no place to go from there. It's true, the pawn on g5 is hanging, but I don't have much difficulty in protecting that pawn, for example, with my f-pawn. And the black queen is still in a very surrounded situation. For example, if queen g3, bishop d3 immediately would be threatening to then sacrifice on g6, and still the black queen is in a very delicate position also. Let's go back. My opponent retreated with queen d6. And now it's time to bring the f-pawn, f4. The idea now is to play f5 and strengthen the attack that way. Black's counterattack is far too slow. My opponent played a6 with the idea on one hand prevent any potential knight b5, but also at the same time to prepare him playing b6 to b5 and then b5 to b4 to annoy me on the queen side. I simply advanced by playing f5. My plan was to answer b5 with a3 in this position. Instead, my opponent played rook f to e8, certainly a logical move, occupying an open file and clearing the f8 square for one of the black pieces in the near future. And again, it's time to get all my pieces into the action. And now it's time to get the rest of my pieces to where they are needed. Rook d to f1. Getting ready for the opening of the f-file. And my opponent is also defending, making sure everything is safe. And I brought my knight f4. Still, the g6 square is protected sufficiently by black's queen, knight, and pawn. Came bishop to d8 and bishop d3. So now everything is in optimal situation. The queen, the bishop, the knight, the white pawn on f5, they are all aiming to the g6 pawn. And black is in an unfortunate situation. They need to use their king being the fourth piece that protects. And now there are multiple ways to win the game. I chose to play f takes g6 in this position, although advancing the pawn also did the job, followed by a sacrifice on g6. For example, the game could develop in this manner, and white would have a winning advantage here too. Instead, I traded on g6. Pawn had to take back to hang on to the h5 pawn, and now I've prepared a nice combination to win 2 pawns and intensify the attack. If black does not capture my bishop right now, the h5 pawn just falls, and white would maintain the attack with 2 extra pawns. Knight took the bishop, knight h5 check. Now if the black king would go to h7, then I would play rook f7, king h8, and even better than capturing black's bishop on b7 is to play knight f6, creating an immediate checkmate threat, and then after bishop f6, the most powerful move is queen takes knight, and black gets checkmated real soon. In this position, black played king h8, but the response is similar. Again, knight f6, disconnecting the black queen from the knight and therefore targeting black's knight immediately. Capturing the knight would not help, as the rook would recapture and black would lose the knight immediately. Playing rook g8 wouldn't help either, because after knight takes and king takes, in addition to playing h5 and winning that way, even stronger is to play rook f6, sacrificing an exchange, and then appearing on g6 with the queen, and then pawn takes bishop with an easily winning position for white. After knight f6, my opponent played rook e4, trying to give up some of his material advantage, but avoid the immediate attack on the black king. Sadly for black, it doesn't really help. I captured the rook and now made a quiet, simple move, after which my opponent resigned. Played queen d1 with the idea to appear on h5 to check. Black is pretty much helpless against it, as for example, after knight f4, which is black's most natural response, I have a nice combination to end the game real quick. By sacrificing my rook against the knight, and then my queen can appear on h5, king g7, and now a very cute 4-move checkmate. Queen g8, queen e8, and here we go. Well, what did we learn from this game? When both sides are castled on opposite sides of the board, time is the essence, and making just good-looking moves may not necessarily be sufficient. You need to play most efficiently, because it becomes a race between the two sides. Who will create deadly threats to the opponent's king first? As we saw in this game, black never got around to doing that. They got stuck too soon, too quick on defense. And then again, sometimes look for the exceptions, such as on move 18 we saw in this game. Typically, my recommendation is to move forward, but this is one of those exceptions when going backwards temporarily is better than moving forward. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame, black has significant material advantage. However, white has several passed pawns. The challenge is that if white right now advances its most far advanced pawn, the h6 pawn, black will capture the pawn on h2. I suggest you pause the recording for a moment and try to figure out the solution on your own before you listen further and hear the correct solution. I think trying to work it out yourself makes you remember ideas more than just listening at a lecture of do this or do that. So first, trying to figure out the correct move on your own is a very helpful way to remember patterns. And the solution is white needs to push the other pawn, b6. Now, black has a bit of time to try to catch that pawn, rook b1, and now an amazing move, which is the only way to win the game. Instead of immediately advancing either of the two passed pawns that white has, which either of them could be caught by one of the black rooks, white can make a very elegant move called the intermezzo by playing bishop b2. Look at that. Either black rook can capture this bishop now, but the problem is that one rook will be in the other rook's way. If the rook from a2 captures, then we advance first the b pawn and then the h pawn. And now the h pawn is unstoppable. Or if black captures with the other rook, with the one from b1, then we will advance the h pawn first, and when black catches that pawn, then the other pawn advances, and black cannot avoid the upcoming checkmate. What a duel! Well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this instructive game followed by the Jewel of the Week. And be back next week for some more chess knowledge. So long until then.